They came without warning. No ships blotting out the sky, no booming messages of peace or war. Just a quiet distortion in the darkness, a ripple in the vast void of space. And then, they were there. The Xyra. Their ships did not gleam with the cold, calculated precision of human engineering. They grew, massive and organic, pulsating with an eerie, living hum. They did not move like machines, but like creatures drifting, breathing, shifting with an unnatural grace. We didn't detect them until they wanted to be seen. Until they stood over our cities, silent and motionless. Watching. Governments panicked. Military forces mobilized, weapons primed. Scientists scrambled to make sense of what they were seeing. The world held its breath, waiting for the inevitable first strike. It never came. Instead, the Xyra sent a single message. Not through radio waves, not through any language we understood. It was implanted directly into the minds of billions, all at once. A voice not human, not mechanical, echoing in our skulls. You are flawed. The world staggered. People screamed, collapsed, clutched their heads. Not in pain, no, the message wasn't violent. But it was invasive, inescapable. A whisper inside our very being. The voice continued, cold and clinical. Your biology is inefficient. Your minds are chaotic. Your history is riddled with destruction. You are an anomaly in the design of intelligent life. And yet, you persist. A pause. As if they, too, were unsure of the conclusion. That should not be possible. Panic swept across the globe. Cities went into lockdown. Every major world leader demanded contact, demanded answers. Some called for diplomacy. Others, for war. The Xyra did not acknowledge either. And then, the final message. We are here to correct this anomaly. The United Nations convened in record time. Every channel was flooded with speculation. Scientists debated what correction meant. Politicians prepared for the worst. And the Xyra? They simply waited. Their ships, if they could be called that, hover just beyond the edges of our atmosphere, as if expecting us to understand something we had no way of knowing. Days passed. Weeks. No further messages, no further actions. The fear settled into an uneasy tension, like a predator watching its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, without warning, the first landing. One of their vessels, a towering, biomechanical construct the size of a skyscraper, descended into the Pacific, sinking into the depths without a ripple. No explosions, no sonic booms. Just, gone. An hour later, another ship folded into existence outside Geneva, where world leaders had gathered. No doors opened, no ramps descended. Instead, they emerged, walking out of their ship as if stepping through a doorway in space. The Xyra were tall. Not unnaturally so, but just wrong enough to unsettle the human brain. Their forms were sleek, elongated, wrapped in what looked like smooth, chitinous armor. No mouths. No visible eyes. Just faces, blank, expressionless plates of obsidian-like material. And yet, we could feel them watching. They did not speak with sound. Their words bypassed language entirely, pouring directly into the minds of those present. Every translator, every diplomat, every leader, each received the same thought at the same time. We will begin the trials. A hush fell over the assembly. Whispers of confusion rippled through the ranks of dignitaries, military officers, and scientists. It was the U.S. ambassador who finally stepped forward, clearing his throat as if his voice had any power in the face of creatures who could speak into his soul. "What trials?" he asked. The Xyra turned their blank faces toward him, heads tilting in eerie unison. "A test of worth." Murmurs erupted into full-on panic. Questions flew. Demands. Threats. But the Xyra did not acknowledge any of it. They simply raised one elongated hand. And people disappeared. No flash of light. No sound. No warning. Just gone. Across the world, thousands vanished. Pulled from streets, homes, workplaces. Parents screamed for lost children. Families clutched empty spaces where loved ones had stood moments before. Chaos. Horror. And then silence. The Xyra turned away. Their message was clear. The trials had begun. The world stood still. Families searched for the missing, their names shouted into silence. Governments demanded answers. Scientists scrambled to understand. But the Xyra gave nothing. No explanations. No warnings. Just a single statement, broadcast into every human mind. The trials have begun. We had no idea what that meant. Sarah Miller woke up in darkness. She had been in her kitchen, pouring coffee. Then, nothing. Now, she was here. The air was cool, sterile. The ground beneath her wasn't ground at all, but a smooth, metallic surface, pulsing faintly with an unnatural rhythm, alive, somehow. A distant hum vibrated in her bones. She wasn't alone. Dozens of people lay around her, stirring, groaning. Some stood, voices rising in panic. Others pressed their hands to their temples, shaking off the remnants of whatever had taken them. Sarah's breath came in short gasps. Where was she? A man in a mechanic's jumpsuit helped a frightened teenager to her feet. An older woman clutched a cross around her neck, whispering prayers. A soldier, judging by his rigid posture, was already assessing the room, scanning for exits, threats, anything useful. Sarah turned in a slow circle, heart pounding. The space they were in stretched endlessly in all directions, lit by an eerie, undulating glow. No doors. No windows. No obvious way out. And then, the voice came. "You have been chosen." The words rang inside their skulls, bypassing ears entirely. People flinched, some crying out, others clapping hands over their heads as if they could block it out. "You will be tested." A new sound. A deep, grinding shift beneath their feet. The floor itself began to move, dividing, splitting into sections. Walls rose from nothing, twisting into an ever-changing labyrinth. The room, if it had ever been a room, was no longer the same. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. They were being separated. Panic set in fast. People tried to hold on to one another, clawing at shifting walls, screaming names. It didn't matter. The space continued to reconfigure, walls sliding like liquid metal, locking people into smaller and smaller groups. Sarah found herself with three others: a young man in a convenience store uniform, a woman in a lab coat, and a grizzled-looking man with a prosthetic arm. The air vibrated again. "Your first trial begins." A section of the wall melted away, revealing a corridor leading into darkness. No instructions. No clues. Just a path forward. The scientist, her name tag read Dr. Elena Vasquez, swallowed hard. "They're watching us." The soldier, because that's what Sarah knew he was, grunted. "Of course they are." Nobody moved. The Xyra had given no weapons, no tools. Only their own instincts. Sarah clenched her fists. They had a choice. Sit here and wait for whatever fate the Xyra had planned. Or step forward. She took the first step. The corridor stretched endlessly, walls shifting as if the ship itself was alive. The floor pulsed under their feet, like the steady heartbeat of some unknowable entity. And then came the first obstacle. A chasm, wide and bottomless. No bridge. No way across. The young man Jason, he had introduced himself, laughed, the sound hollow and sharp. Great. So we're just supposed to jump? Dr. Vasquez shook her head, studying the edges. No. This isn't just a gap. It's a test. The soldier Mason knelt, running his prosthetic fingers over the ground. There has to be a way. Sarah stared at the abyss, mind racing. If this was a trial, the Xyra must expect them to solve it. Which meant. She stepped to the very edge, heart pounding, and extended a foot. The air shimmered. A panel appeared beneath her foot, flickering into existence like a mirage. She exhaled sharply. It's invisible. Jason blinked. You mean we can cross? Sarah nodded. But only if we trust that it's there. Mason grinned. Hell of a test. One by one, they stepped forward. The path revealed itself with every hesitant step, the bridge appearing only when they believed it would. Jason exhaled shakily. This is some Indiana Jones shit. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They had passed. For now. The trials continued. Some were physical corridors collapsing, walls closing in, obstacles that required speed, strength, and endurance. Others tested the mind puzzles that twisted logic, mazes that shifted with every step. And some were worse. The Xyra weren't just testing their bodies. They were testing something deeper. Fear. Morality. Trust. One room forced them to choose. One of them had to stay behind for the others to move forward. The door would not open unless a sacrifice was made. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward without hesitation. I'll stay, she said. Jason grabbed her arm. No. We don't even know what will happen to you. She smiled, sad but determined. That's the point, isn't it? Mason's jaw clenched. He was a soldier. He understood sacrifice. But this wasn't war. This was calculated cruelty. Sarah's throat tightened. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But Vasquez was already stepping back. I hope you make it, she said. Then the door closed, and she was gone. Jason punched the wall. Fuck. Mason turned away, jaw tight. Sarah pressed her hand against the cold metal. They had passed the test. But it didn't feel like winning. More trials. More impossible choices. The Xyra were watching, studying. Learning. And then, the final test. The door before them was different. It did not pulse or shift. It waited. They stepped through. And froze. Because the room beyond was filled with people. Hundreds of them. And on the far wall, a single message. Only half of you may leave. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Jason swore under his breath. Jesus Christ. Mason just exhaled slowly, eyes dark with understanding. Sarah turned to look at the crowd. Some of them were already murmuring, realization dawning. They weren't finished. This was the real test. And this time, they would have to decide who passed. The silence was deafening. The room was silent. Hundreds of people stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at the glowing message on the far wall. Only half of you may leave. No instructions. No countdown. Just a cruel, simple ultimatum. Sarah felt her pulse pounding in her skull. Jason whispered, "This has to be a trick." Mason exhaled, his face unreadable. "It's not." Someone in the crowd shouted, "They want us to fight." The words rippled through the room like wildfire, panic taking root. A man in a tattered suit stepped forward, voice shaking. "We don't have to do this. There's another way." A woman near the back scoffed. "What other way? Did you see a secret door?" "Because I didn't." The tension in the air grew thick, suffocating. Sarah looked around. She saw the fear in their eyes, the hesitation. But she also saw something worse. Desperation. Then someone screamed. A man had lunged at another, tackling him to the floor. Fists flew, raw, panicked. Someone else shoved forward, trying to break it up, only for a third person to join in. The chaos spread like a virus. Sarah turned to Mason, her voice low. "We need to stop this before it gets worse." Mason's jaw was tight. "It's already worse." Jason stumbled back as two men grappled near him, their faces twisted in rage. "This is insane. We're doing their job for them." Sarah scanned the crowd, her heart racing. They needed to make people listen. They needed. A loud crack echoed through the room. Someone had hit the floor and wasn't moving. The fight stopped. Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. All eyes turned to the fallen man. Blood pooled beneath his head. His chest rose and fell in ragged, uneven breaths. Sarah clenched her teeth. Not dead. Not yet. A murmur spread through the group. Guilt. Horror. But beneath it, a dark realization. One down. They needed to lose half. And this was one way to do it. Mason moved first, stepping between the crowd and the unconscious man. His presence alone seemed to push back the growing madness. "No more," he said, his voice steady. "We're not playing this game." A woman near the front glared at him. "Then what do you suggest, soldier? We just stand here and wait to starve?" Mason didn't flinch. "No. We decide together." Someone else laughed bitterly. "And what if no one wants to stay behind?" A new voice cut through the noise. "Then we decide." Sarah turned. A man had stepped forward from the crowd, his expression eerily calm. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with streaks of gray in his beard and an air of quiet authority. Jason muttered, "Oh, great. Here comes the dictator." The man ignored him, sweeping his gaze across the room. "We can wait for volunteers, or we can choose." His tone was even, almost too steady. "But one way or another, we will make this choice. Because if we don't, the Xyra will make it for us." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was it. The breaking point. Minutes stretched into eternity. No one wanted to speak. No one wanted to step forward. Sarah took a slow breath. "We can do this." She raised her voice. "We don't have to make this about strength or weakness. We have parents here. Children. People who have more to lose. We should." She didn't get to finish. Because the floor shifted. A deep hum resonated through the room, the walls pulsing in rhythm. The Xyra were watching. And they were tired of waiting. A glowing barrier flickered into existence, slicing straight through the crowd. People screamed. Half were on one side, half on the other. Jason slammed his hands against the invisible wall. What the? Sarah stumbled back, pulse racing. The message on the wall flickered. The choice has been made. A hole opened in the ceiling. A sudden, violent pull yanked the people on the wrong side of the barrier upward. Sarah watched in horror as they were lifted away, silent, weightless, faces frozen in terror. Jason was on that side. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with panic. Sarah. And then he was gone. The hole sealed shut. The barrier disappeared. The survivors stood in stunned silence, breathing hard. Mason exhaled through his nose. They never wanted us to choose, he said quietly. Sarah's hands shook. They just wanted to see if we would. The Xyra had their answer. And the trials were far from over. The silence after the purge was suffocating. Jason was gone. Half of them were. No screams, no struggle, just gone. Sarah's fingers curled into fists. Her breath came fast and shallow. Mason stood rigid, his face unreadable. The others shifted uneasily, eyes darting between the ceiling where their people had vanished and the message still glowing on the wall. The choice has been made. Made for them. The Xyra didn't care how humans made decisions. They only cared about what happened after. The walls shifted again. The remaining survivors flinched as the space around them twisted, reshaping into something new. The floor stretched, the ceiling expanded. When the movement stopped, they stood in a vast chamber. No doors. No visible exits. Just a towering, black monolith in the center, pulsing faintly like a living thing. Mason muttered, "Well, that's not ominous at all." A woman behind Sarah exhaled shakily. "Are we supposed to touch it?" The monolith answered before anyone could try. It spoke. Not in words, not like the Xyra's invasive messages. This was different. The monolith pushed images into their minds, scenes flashing too fast to process. War. Fire. Cities collapsing. People screaming. Blood. So much blood. Sarah staggered. Mason caught her arm, his face pale. "They're showing us our own history. More images. More memories. The worst moments of humanity laid bare: genocide, cruelty, betrayal. A relentless, damning record of everything vile humans had ever done." A choked sob echoed from the group. A man dropped to his knees, hands gripping his head. "No," he whispered. "This isn't all we are." Sarah clenched her teeth. "They're testing us again." The monolith pulsed, faster now. More images, this time of the Xyra. Their history. And it was empty. No war. No conflict. No suffering. A species that had never fought, never burned, never bled. A species that had never struggled. Sarah's breath caught. That was the test. The Xyra didn't understand them. Didn't understand how humanity had survived its own brutality. The monolith's final message burned into their minds like a brand. "Explain." Silence. Then, a nervous laugh. A sharp, broken sound. "You've gotta be kidding me," someone muttered. Mason ran a hand over his face. "They think this is a question with a simple answer." Sarah inhaled slowly, forcing herself to focus. "We have to make them understand." A man near the back scoffed. Understand what? That we're monsters. Because that's what they're showing us. Sarah turned to him. Then we show them something else. She took a step forward. The monolith hummed. Watching. Waiting. Sarah pressed her palm against the surface. Memories. But this time, they were hers. A father lifting his daughter onto his shoulders to see a parade. A stranger holding out a hand to pull someone from rising flood waters. A nurse whispering to a dying man, keeping him company in his last moments. A soldier stepping in front of a bullet to save a civilian. Hope. Sacrifice. Love. The monolith trembled. And then, it fought back. The darkness surged, slamming through her thoughts, twisting them. Showing the worst again. As if rejecting the goodness, as if denying it. Sarah gritted her teeth. No. You don't get to do that. She pushed back. Images poured from her, moments that defined humanity, moments that mattered. People rebuilding after destruction. Enemies setting aside their hatred. Hands reaching for each other instead of weapons. The monolith shook. Others stepped forward, one by one. Mason. The woman who had prayed earlier. The man who had scoffed before, now quiet, determined. They added their memories. Their proof. The darkness fought. But humanity refused to let go. The monolith flickered. The hum wavered. And then. It stopped. The silence was deafening. Sarah staggered back, Mason catching her arm again. The monolith was still now. Dim. And then, in the very center, a single word appeared. Understood. A deep, resonating click echoed through the chamber. A doorway materialized, glowing faintly. Someone let out a shaky breath. Did we just win? Mason didn't answer. Sarah turned back to the monolith. Did they really understand? Or was this just the beginning of something worse? The monolith had spoken. Understood. The word glowed in the air, pulsing softly, as if the Xyra were absorbing what had just happened. The doorway ahead shimmered, waiting. An invitation. Or a trap. No one moved. Mason's voice was low. I don't trust it. Sarah exhaled, her heart still racing from the fight against the monolith's overwhelming darkness. We don't have a choice. The survivors exchanged glances. They had passed the test, hadn't they? Mason grunted, stepping forward first. If this kills me, I'm haunting all of you. A nervous chuckle rippled through the group. A moment of levity. Maybe their last. And then they stepped through. The space beyond was wrong. Not in the way the previous rooms had been shifting, organic, alive. This was different. It was empty. No walls. No ceiling. Just an endless black void stretching in all directions. A floor existed beneath their feet, but it wasn't solid. It felt like walking on pressure, like standing on the surface of gravity itself. And in the center waiting stood the Xyra. Not a hologram. Not an echo in their minds. Real. Sarah's breath caught. They were taller than she expected, their bodies sleek and elongated, wrapped in that dark, chitinous armor that didn't quite seem like armor at all. Their faces were smooth and expressionless, featureless plates of obsidian-like material. But there was something new in them. Something she hadn't seen before. Hesitation. One of them took a step forward. The air around it warped, as if reality itself bent to accommodate its existence. We did not expect this. The voice resonated inside their skulls, but it was softer this time. Less of an imposition. More of a question. Sarah swallowed. What did you expect? A pause. Then. Destruction. The room darkened. The Xyra lifted a hand, and suddenly, they were seeing it again. The simulations. The predictions. The Xyra had tested species before. Many of them. Civilizations that had faced the same trials, the same impossible choices. And each time, when pushed to the brink, they had collapsed. They had turned on each other. They had destroyed themselves. Sarah clenched her jaw. That's why they kept pushing us. Kept forcing us into no-win situations. They wanted us to break. But they hadn't. Mason crossed his arms. So what now? The Xyra did not answer right away. They turned their featureless heads toward each other. A silent conversation. And then, a shift. A ripple in the air. Sarah's vision blurred, and suddenly, the void changed. They were somewhere else. A city. No, the city. Earth. But not as it was. As it could be. Towering structures, humming with energy. Clean, endless skies. No hunger. No war. Humanity not just surviving, but thriving. Sarah inhaled sharply. What is this? A possibility. The Xyra stood beside them now, watching the scene with something that almost resembled curiosity. This is what you are capable of. If you endure. Mason's hands curled into fists. You put us through hell just to see if we'd make it? The Xyra tilted their heads. We needed to know if you were different. A pulse of energy. The vision shifted again. A wasteland. Cities reduced to rubble. Skies black with ash. A version of Earth that had failed. This is the other possibility. Silence. Sarah's throat tightened. The Xyra weren't giving them answers. They were giving them choices. Jason had been right. The Xyra had never planned to correct humanity. They had wanted to see if humanity could correct itself. Sarah turned to face them, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. What happens now? Another pause. Then, the final words. We will not interfere. But we will be watching. The visions vanished. The void returned. And one last doorway opened. This time, they knew where it led. Home. Mason exhaled. Well. That was a lot. Sarah nodded, still reeling. Still processing. She looked back one last time, but the Xyra were already gone. No fanfare. No explanations. Just silence. And yet, she knew the truth. They hadn't just won the trials. They had changed them. For the first time, the Xyra had doubted their own certainty. And that doubt, that curiosity, was what made them afraid of humanity. Because humanity didn't follow the rules. They made their own. They stepped through the final door. And the stars swallowed them whole. The door swallowed them, and for a moment, there was nothing. No light. No sound. Just the sensation of falling. And then, gravity slammed back into their bodies. Cold air rushed into Sarah's lungs. Her feet hit solid ground. She gasped. They were home. Or at least, they thought they were. The sky was the first thing she noticed. It was Earth's sky blue, vast, endless. But the air was too still. The world around them felt off, like a perfect replica just a fraction of a degree wrong. Sarah turned. Mason stood beside her, scanning the landscape. Others were there too, the survivors. Not just the ones from her group. All of them. Hundreds of people stood in silence, taking in their surroundings. They were on the outskirts of a city, one that looked like Earth, but unfamiliar. Too clean. Too perfect. No cars. No distant hum of civilization. Just empty streets and pristine buildings stretching into the distance. Jason's voice, hoarse, disbelieving, cut through the quiet. Is this real? Sarah turned. He was there. Alive. He looked just as shaken as the rest of them. Mason exhaled slowly. No way the Xyra sent us back without one last trick up their sleeves. A deep hum resonated through the sky. And then, the Xyra spoke. You have returned. The words came not from the sky, not from the city, but from everywhere. Sarah felt it crawl under her skin. This world is what could be. The ground shifted beneath them. In an instant, the city changed. Buildings cracked. The air grew heavy. The blue sky darkened to a choking gray. The streets filled with the echoes of distant screams. Explosions bloomed in the distance. Skyscrapers collapsed in slow, terrible destruction. A glimpse of failure. This is what may come. Sarah's stomach clenched. They're still testing us. Mason's hand rested on his sidearm, even though they all knew it wouldn't help. What do you want? The sky rippled. The ruined city reset, returning to its flawless, untouched form. The anomaly remains. Sarah's breath caught. They still didn't understand. The Xyra had tested them, observed them, even doubted themselves for the first time. But now, faced with the answer, they refused to accept it. Because humanity was not logical. They were impossible. The voice of the Xyra, deep, resonant, unreadable, spoke one final time. We must decide. And just like that, the sky tore open. A black void stretched above them, filled with shifting, unrecognizable shapes. The Xyra were no longer distant observers. They were here, their presence pressing against the air itself. Jason tensed. I really don't like where this is going. Sarah stepped forward, ignoring the fear clawing at her ribs. You don't get to decide anything for us. The air shuddered. The Xyra watched. And then something changed. The void above them flickered. The towering, unknowable presence of the Xyra hesitated. Sarah realized why. They didn't know what to do. For the first time, the ones who had always controlled the experiment were faced with an outcome they hadn't predicted. A paradox they couldn't solve. Mason's voice was steady. If you were going to wipe us out, you'd have done it already. No response. Sarah took another step forward, staring up at the vast, shifting darkness. You asked us to explain. We did. You watched us survive. We did. Her voice didn't waver. We passed your tests. So what now? The Xyra didn't answer. They simply left. Not in a dramatic burst of light. Not in a final, booming declaration. One moment, their presence filled the sky. The next, they were gone. Silence. Jason let out a breath he'd been holding. Did we just win? Mason didn't look convinced. I don't think this was about winning. Sarah turned, scanning the city pristine, untouched. But it was just an illusion. A possibility. The real world was still out there, waiting. and the Xyra would be watching. Not as gods. Not as conquerors. As something far more unsettling. As students. Because humanity had taught them something terrifying. Something they weren't sure they could understand. That sometimes, the impossible survives. And sometimes, the anomaly, wins.